This is my Unit 6 video blog. In the years after World War II, there was a general fear that the United States would enter another depression. However, by the 1950s, the economy surged upward in a boom that would last for 2 decades. Cheap energy, increased worker productivity, and the GI Bill of Rights were all reasons for this economic success. Americans started to migrate towards the Sunbelt of the South and West, taking the power out of the old Northeast. Suburbia grew as well, with mostly whites fleeing the more racially diverse cities. The Yalta Agreement before the end of the war discussed peacetime plans. However, different versions for a post-war world led to a standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Truman Doctrine in 1947 unleashed a policy of containment, where America would support all free people resisting Soviet control. The Marshall Plan gave economic resistance to European countries for war reparations and to revive their economies. The threat of the Soviet Union and the fall of China to communism in 1949 spurred the Red Hunt by Senator McCarthy and others. In the presidential election of 1948, Truman battled to win a second term, and much to the surprise of the nation, won the election, even though his Democratic Party had been split 3 ways. The Korean conflict started with the attack on South Korea by North Korea in 1950, and Truman almost immediately passed the NSC 68 document and went into the UN for troops to fight North Korea. General MacArthur made impressive gains at first, but started to publicly criticize Truman for a disagreement over whether or not to bomb Manchuria. Truman saw no other choice but to fire the general, but it was not a very popular decision at home. The era of Eisenhower was a relatively relaxed period compared to what would soon afterwards face the nation. Consumerism came to define the American way of life as advertising increased and the American people discovered they had plenty of money to spend. Eisenhower supported a small government philosophy and stopped the enormous military buildup. He also supported the Interstate Highway System Act of 1956, which built 42,000 miles of highways all over the country. Although he was reluctant to get involved in the civil rights movement, he intervened in Little Rock by sending in federal troops to escort the 9 African-American students to a previously all-white school. The Eisenhower Doctrine in 1957 pledged U.S. military aid and economic aid to Middle Eastern countries threatened by communist aggression. Fidel Castro seized control of Cuba in 1959 and became a satellite to Moscow, starting hostile relations with the little island. President John F. Kennedy swung into the White House with a new energy. He pushed for a strategy of flexible response and showered upon the people his dream of the new frontier. The Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 and the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 threatened American security and showed the continuations of hostile relations with the Communist Soviet Union. Although a supporter of the Black Civil Rights Movement, he was not able to push through much legislation for the cause because of the opposition of Southern senators. After his assassination on November 1963, his Vice President Lyndon Baines Johnson was able to pass the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1964. LBJ's Great Society was a set of economic and welfare programs aimed at transforming the American way of life. Part of this was his famous War on Poverty. Although Johnson was able to greatly drop the poverty level, he tried to tackle too much at once with his involvement in the Vietnam conflict, which was unpopular with the American people, and he decided not to run in the presidential election of 1968. President Richard Nixon introduced his policy of Vietnamization, which withdrew troops from Vietnam and supplied the South Vietnamese with money, weapons, training, and advice so they could continue to fight their own war. He also ushered in a period of detente with the Soviet Union by negotiation with China. However, his successes in office were overshadowed by the Watergate scandal and televised hearings from 1973 to 1974. When it seemed that Nixon would be impeached, he resigned, leaving his Vice President Gerald Ford in the White House. Because Ford pardoned Nixon, his presidency was immediately unpopular, and Democratic Jimmy Carter won the election of 1976. At first he was very popular, but he was considered an outsider by Congress. The Iran hostage crisis in 1979 humiliated his presidency as Carter waited for a stable government to negotiate with. The situation dragged on for the rest of his term, and the hostages were not freed until the day of Reagan's inauguration. President Ronald Reagan was elected by a very large, growing number of conservatives in the country. He pushed for his program of supply-side economics, of lower taxes and new right social policies. The Cold War became colder once more with Reagan's hard-as-nails outlook for communism. However, Soviet leader Gorbachev introduced policies of glasnost and perestroika, which aimed at reviving the economy by adapting free market policies of the West, effectively dooming the Soviet Union. Reagan added almost $2 trillion in debt in his 8 years in office. Republican George H. W. Bush won the 1988 presidential election. His administration saw the unraveling of communism as communist Eastern European countries toppled their governments one by one, including the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. In 1991, the USSR disintegrated into component parts, and Gorbachev stepped one. When Iraq leader Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in 1990, the UN launched a massive international military deployment, spearheaded by the US. It started 41 days, only 4 of which were on land, since the rest were all bombing raids. Saddam Hussein accepted a ceasefire and Kuwait was liberated. Democratic Bill Clinton won the presidential election of 1992, promising to stimulate the economy, reform welfare system, and overhaul healthcare. The congressional election of 1994 was overwhelmingly Republican thanks to Newt Gingrich and his Contract with America, leading to arguments between Congress and the president. The economy continued to grow into the new millennium, driven by the new internet businesses and high-tech and media companies. In January of 1988, it was revealed that Clinton had an affair with Monica Lewinsky and was denied under oath. He was impeached by the House, but not by the Senate. Republican George W. Bush won the controversial election in 2000 against Al Gore. The 9/11 attacks killed approximately 3,000 people. Bush responded by making Osama bin Laden the enemy along with al-Qaeda and ordered a massive military campaign against Afghanistan. Bush also launched a controversial invasion of Iraq in March 2003 to oust Saddam Hussein from power, which was achieved in less than a month. However, the people of Iraq did not embrace democracy as had been expected, and the U.S. kept troops in Iraq for reconstruction.